Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When a battle-hardened veteran builds his dream cabin deep in the Colorado wilds, he expects peace. But when a ruthless HOA queenpin tries to claim his land with forged papers and fake rules, he's forced into a war he never asked for, one fought with cameras, lawyers, and grit. They say building a home with your own hands makes it mean more. I'd argue it's the only way it ever means anything at all. I spent 10 years of my life carving my place into the land like a scar into old skin, slow, exact, and permanent. The cabin sat high above Briar Creek Lake, tucked among ponderosa pines that moaned with every gust of wind off the water. No road signs, no neighbors' wind chimes, no HOA newsletters wedged into the doorframe. Just the sound of sawdust settling, my own sweat soaking into pine beams, and the creak of old stone dragged out of the ridge and laid one slab at a time. When I first inherited the land from my uncle back in 2007, it was just raw Colorado wilderness. My friends thought I was insane. "You're gonna live out in the sticks like a mountain ghost," they joked. Maybe that's exactly what I wanted. After 2 tours and 15 years engineering structures that only got blown to hell, I figured I'd finally build something meant to stay. The parcel was legally mine, registered with the county assessor, and surveyed back when my uncle still had hands steady enough to sign a deed. No mortgage, no liens, no shared driveways or communal flower beds. Just land. My land. It started slow. Weekends and long leaves. I milled my own lumber from deadfall and salvaged barnwood, not because I had to, but because I wanted the bones of the house to have a story. I laid the foundation myself with rebar and rock, pouring concrete with a shovel and sweat. I remember the exact day the roof went on too. My birthday. No candles, just the sound of rain tapping on a cedar shake roof that I'd set into place with my own damn hands. When I finally called in the county inspector to finalize everything, he whistled low as he walked through. Said it was more sound than half the prefab garbage thrown up on the other side of the lake. We shook hands. I signed the last page. I was home. For the first time in 48 years, I had something no one else touched. That weekend, I mounted the cameras, one on the tall pine near the drive, one above the door, and one overlooking the dock. Not for paranoia, just a habit. Old instincts die hard. I posted 3 signs: private property, no trespassing, and not part of any HOA. I didn't think they'd be necessary. Foolish of me. The first knock came 2 days after I moved in. It wasn't even a knock, really, more like a diplomatic siege. 3 people marched up my gravel path like they were walking into a city council meeting, clipboards in hand. Leading the pack, a woman with a stacked blonde bob, pristine beige pantsuit, and the kind of strained smile that usually preceded passive-aggressive war crimes. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mr. Lynch, I presume?" she asked, squinting at me like I might be a raccoon impersonating a homeowner. I nodded. "You're on private land. Can I help you?" "I'm Karen Brooks," she announced, as if that should mean something to me. "President of the Lakewood Garden Hills Homeowners Association." She gestured to the 2 beige shadows behind her, both middle-aged, both holding binders with what I could only assume were bylaws printed in 12-point Times New Roman. "We're here to discuss your recent construction project and review your architectural compliance documentation." I blinked. "You're going to need to back that whole sentence up and start from reality." Karen's expression stiffened. "All new structures within Lakewood jurisdiction require review and approval from the HOA board prior to groundbreaking. I'm afraid we have no record of your permit requests." I scratched my jaw, more amused than irritated, at least at first. "This ain't Lakewood jurisdiction. You're standing on my dirt, Briar Ridge, separate parcel, private, unincorporated. And I've got 15 years of property taxes and a signed county build permit that says you and your bylaws can stay on your side of the lake." Karen's eye twitched. She clearly hadn't expected pushback. Or maybe she hadn't expected me to speak in full sentences. Either way, it put a hairline crack in her smug armor. "We have maps," she snapped, flipping her binder open. "Your property appears to be within visual territory of Lakewood Garden Hills, which places it under shared visual compliance." Visual compliance? I raised an eyebrow. "You mean because your HOA can see my cabin from across the water, you think you get to tell me what to do with it?" "Lake aesthetics are community matters," she sniffed. "Structures visible from Lakewood must adhere to agreed standards. Exterior colors, shoreline modifications, fencing, even roofing style. I stared at her in disbelief. So if I stain my deck the wrong shade of brown, your little cabal will what? Fine me? Burn it down. She didn't laugh. Neither did the goons behind her. The silence stretched. I finally pointed at the posted sign behind me. That says I'm not part of any HOA. You see that? She followed my finger, her face like someone had just farted during a funeral. Signs don't change legal status, she replied coldly. I suggest you prepare to submit compliance documents within 30 days, or the board will proceed with enforcement measures. Ma'am, I said, folding my arms, you and your clipboard have exactly 60 seconds to get off my land before I start treating this like a trespassing incident. The word trespassing clearly unsettled her more than she expected. She backed a half step. Her cronies hesitated. Karen composed herself, gave me a polite death glare, and said, I look forward to resolving this, for your sake. Then they left, heels crunching down my gravel like they owned the damn place. I watched them go, heart oddly calm but stomach tight. I hadn't lived around people in years, but I knew predators when I saw them. And those folks, they weren't looking for peace. They were looking for control. 3 days passed with no sign of Karen or her HOA squad, and I allowed myself the brief luxury of thinking maybe they'd finally realized they were barking up the wrong tree. I spent the mornings patching the dock, cleaning up leftover construction debris, and finally hanging the old cedar swing that had belonged to my uncle. It felt damn good, too, drinking coffee in the early sun, listening to the water slap gently against the rocks, and knowing I'd earned every nail and joint in that home. But peace, I've learned, is never permanent when control freaks are involved. The first warning came in a crisp white envelope with a gold-embossed emblem that looked like it belonged on a bottle of Chardonnay. It was hand-delivered and wedged under my door like a passive-aggressive grenade. The letter inside was labeled Formal Notice of Non-Compliance, typed in all caps, with a threatening tone polished up by legalese that practically screamed Karen's perfume. The body of the letter informed me that I was in violation of HOA Construction Ordinance 7A for having erected a permanent structure within Lakewood visual boundaries without written architectural review. The penalty? Fines not to exceed $100 per day of non-compliance, backdated to the date of first visible construction. I laughed out loud. Then I read it again and laughed harder. Not just because it was absurd, but because the damn letter didn't even list my address correctly. They pulled it from a Zillow estimate of a nearby parcel. Still, I scanned the whole thing and sent it to Jenna, my attorney. I'd known her since Iraq, when she'd argued down a colonel with the same calm menace she now reserved for paperwork. She called back the same afternoon, voice calm, but amused. Garrett, she said, these people are trying HOA voodoo on federal land law. That's like throwing pixie dust at a freight train. I sent her everything. Copies of my deed, the build permit from the county, tax receipts from the past 17 years, time-stamped photos of construction from day one, and a copy of the final. Inspection signed off by the county engineer. Jenna compiled it all into a formal rebuttal, notarized and sent by certified mail to Karen's HOA headquarters, which, amusingly enough, turned out to be a converted garage at the back of her cul-de-sac. The next day, she responded, not Jenna, Karen. She pulled up to the edge of my driveway in her pristine white Lexus SUV like she was preparing for a standoff at the Alamo. She stepped out holding a thick envelope and marched up to my gate in her pressed khakis and manicured fury. I brought this as a courtesy, she said, holding out the packet. It's a revised declaration from the HOA regarding the lot in question. I didn't take it. I already sent you a response, I said. Through my lawyer. Try using a mailbox like everyone else. Karen's smile was brittle. That lawyer failed to consider a very important fact. Your property is under a legacy agreement. My father, Arthur B. Brooks, had a verbal contract with the prior landholder, your uncle, stating the lot was intended for my son's future residence. It took every ounce of military discipline I had not to laugh in her face. You're claiming my uncle, who died in 2007, promised this land to your son. Verbally? That's correct, she said, proudly. It was discussed at a local Chamber of Commerce event in 2005. Multiple people remember it. Was there anything in writing? Well, she hesitated. Not officially, but intent holds legal weight in property discussions when community interests are involved. Lady, I said, you are not the community. You are a bored retiree with a Napoleon complex. Her expression hardened. "This is your final warning, Mr. Lynch. You can cooperate with the HOA and begin the transition process." "Transition?" I asked. "To return the lot to its intended use as part of our community." I stepped forward, crossing my own threshold, and looked her dead in the eye. "Karen, I have GPS-stamped surveys, tax records, and notarized deeds going back to 2007. The only thing you're transitioning into is a federal lawsuit." That did it. She spun on her heel, muttering something about calling the county, and stormed back to her car. I watched her drive off, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't pissed. Not rattled, pissed, because I knew the type. The kind who can't take no unless it's followed by, "Ma'am, we're so sorry." Jenna followed up with a formal cease and desist the next morning, addressed to both Karen and the HOA board. We made it official. Any further contact, threats, or attempts at enforcement would be treated as harassment and responded to with legal action. But of course, HOA folks don't like legal boundaries unless they're the ones drawing them. 2 days later, I received another letter. This time it was stamped urgent, property acquisition notice. I opened it slowly. Inside was a copy of what appeared to be a community resolution passed by a vote allegedly, declaring my property subject to community recapture and reassignment, citing an obscure-sounding annexation proposal of 2004. The document looked off. The font was inconsistent. The seal was blurry. There was no notary stamp. And the kicker, it was signed on behalf of the board by Karen Brooks herself. I sent the whole mess to Jenna. Her reply was short and surgical. "That's forgery. We're going to war. They don't roll out a forgery like a red carpet. They slip it under the door like a pest." The package arrived mid-morning when the light over the lake was flat and the air smelled faintly of pine resin and diesel from a distant tractor. It was a heavy manila envelope, like someone expected I'd want to keep the thing in a drawer. Inside was a single sheet, an agreement apparently signed in 2006, bearing names I'd never seen, an embossed-looking seal that blurred under my thumb, and a scrawl that someone wanted me to accept as my uncle's signature. The type said it all. Legacy conveyance agreement. Lakeward parcel allocation. The gist was brazen. My lot had been set aside, supposedly by my uncle's intent, for allocation to community members, specifically naming Brooks' family Zachary. Brooks, no notary stamp, no county recording number, no chain of title note, just a printed paragraph and a signature someone had copied badly enough that an untrained eye could tell, but good enough to intimidate neighbors who didn't know deeds from dinner plates. I read it twice, then counted the letters and the names and the date like some bored old man trying to find a hidden code. The fraud was amateurish. Someone had clearly started with a scan of a legitimate document and then doctored the text. But that didn't matter. Forged or not, a paper like that can do work if you hand it to the right people and let rumor do the rest of the job. Within 48 hours, the culvert outside my property became a bulletin board. Someone, apparently working through the HOA network, had printed up cheap flyers that announced an emergency community vote and plastered them on telephone poles and mailboxes down the main lane into Lakewood Garden Hills. The flyers called for recapture of Lakeward lots to preserve community character. There was a line in bold, "Immediate action required. No return address, only Karen's name at the bottom like a signature meant to anchor authority." A teenage kid across the road, a kid who once delivered my feed sacks and who'd always been polite, walked up my drive handing me one with an apologetic look and said, "They want everyone to come to the meeting tonight, Mr. Lynch." I'm sorry. He looked like he wanted to apologize for the way the world had decided to run. That night, the HOA convened in the cramped community hall. Fluorescent lights, folding chairs, coffee gone bitter. I didn't show up. I was a private landowner and had no intention of validating a sham meeting by attending, but I watched the walkie-talkie feed from the camera I'd set in the pine above my dock. People milled in, neighbors who didn't know me, who thought maybe this was about shorelines or dock rules. Karen stood on a platform like a woman rehearsed for spectacle, and she held up a copy of the legacy conveyance as if it were gospel. They voted. I watched a hand raise, then another, and heard the murmur of consensus through a half-hearted PA system. The measure passed to request county review for community reassignment. It was a hollow, performative vote. No legal teeth, but a soundbite that could be faxed, forwarded, and planted. Within 24 hours, a local Facebook feed ran a post. Community acts to preserve lakeside lots, vote passes, comments filled with righteous phrases, about time, protect the view, Finally, someone doing something. Narrative builds fast. When people want a story to be true, my mailbox was next. The first one was a thin stack of official-looking eviction notices printed on letterhead that used the HOA's logo and referenced the fake agreement. They were sloppy, the grammar wobbled, the address lines were smudged, but the envelope was stamped with immediate enforcement. Another wave arrived the following morning. 3 notices stuffed into the slot as if the person stuffing them had been told to make them feel like rain. One flyer was more direct. Temporary occupancy suspension pending community adjudication. The phrasing made my teeth ache. I documented it all. Photos of each piece of paper, time-stamped footage of the kid handing me his flyer, a slow pan of Karen at the podium. I logged names of people at the meeting from the webcam. I called Jenna and read the notices into the phone like I was reading someone else's bad fiction aloud. She encouraged calm and procedure with her usual clipped certainty, but she also told me to expect this. They will try to create momentum and then cry foul when you challenge them. Don't let the noise get under your skin. Let the law do the heavy lifting. I took action in the ways that mattered. I drove into town and made copies of the Courier's public notices, then walked into the county recorder's office and asked them to pull anything they might have on the so-called legacy conveyance. The clerk gave me a patient smile and a printed report. No record of the agreement, no filings in 2006, nothing in the chain of title to support Karen's paper. I left with a stamped page that said no record found, and it felt for a moment like I'd found armor. But the HOA's campaign didn't stop at flyers and meetings. Someone began slipping anonymous letters into my gate, threats thinly veiled with community concern. "We are disappointed," they read in a formal tone. "We hope to come to an amicable resolution." Another said, "You are endangering property values." The people who left them were masks. The handwriting changed, but each letter left the same imprint, intimidation masquerading as civic duty. I started to hear landlord gossip at the feed store and the cafe in the next town over, people asking, in whispers, "Can you believe someone built out there?" And, "Wonder who's paying for that place." Rumors are slow poison. I called an old friend who worked at the local paper and asked him to hold off on any stories. He paused, then said, "Garrett, if this turns into a fight, you'll have headlines. People love a veteran versus HOA story. I didn't want headlines. I wanted the mail to stop, so I upped my game quietly. I added another camera facing the access lane, connected a backup drive in a lockbox, and changed the combination on the gate lock to a code known only to me and Jenna. I logged every contact, every flyer, every face I could capture. I wrote down the times the flyers went up and the names of people who walked the road that afternoon. When the kid from across the road came by again, looking at the ground, I told him straightforwardly that if anyone asked him to post things on my property, he should refuse. He nodded and said, "They said everyone would get paid a little for helping." It was a small, poisonous detail, a payment incentive to manufacture consensus. Jenna finally filed a preliminary motion. Nothing dramatic yet, just a crisp, formal letter to the HOA and a demand they cease dissemination of any falsified documents and stop all enforcement actions. She attached the county recorder's stamp that said "no record found," and she requested a meeting with the board to address the forgery. The letter would land on Karen's desk by certified mail, and it would require a signature. It was a small trap, bureaucratic and clean. If they refused to sign, it would look like an evasion. If they signed and lied, it would look like collusion. I sat across from the lake that evening, the water a sheet of ink, and realized this wasn't about shingles or boat ramps. This was about momentum and narrative, paperwork and people. They'd started a campaign to create a truth that didn't exist, and my task, apparently, was to prove otherwise with other people's stamps and signatures. It was tedious, and it was ugly, but it was what I'd trained for. Methodical, stubborn, salt and sweat work. The war they'd started was one I knew how to finish if I kept my head and my evidence in order. By the time Jenna filed the official lawsuit, I had a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. We titled it Lynch v. Lakewood Garden Hills HOA et al., and included over 70 pages of documentation, deed history, notarized tax records, correspondence logs, timestamps from cameras, digital copies of every forged notice, and a side-by-side comparison of my uncle's known signature and the one Karen had tried to pass off in her little legacy conveyance. Jenna had even highlighted the font inconsistencies and sloppy Photoshop work like a teacher grading a fraudulent term paper. The suit named the HOA Karen Brooks and any unidentified parties involved in the creation or distribution of falsified legal claims related to my property. Among the charges, defamation, property interference, attempted coercion, forgery, and a special claim under Colorado Civil Code for fraudulent simulation of public authority. It wasn't just a cease and desist, it was the beginning of a siege. Karen's response came in the form of a countersuit, predictably melodramatic, riddled with vague language about communal integrity, unspoken agreements of stewardship, and, of course, the vision of her late father, Arthur B. Brooks. She even included a letter printed in cursive font like a wedding invitation, claiming that the house on my land had disrupted the psychological tranquility of the HOA community. It was, Jenna remarked dryly, the first time I've seen the phrase visual assault used outside of a YouTube comment section. That would have been enough to laugh off, except then Karen added her son to the suit, Zachary Brooks, 25 years old, a man-child with a history longer than his work resume. I didn't know much about him at the time, other than that I'd once seen him doing donuts in a golf cart down by the Lakewood boat ramp. I asked Jenna to run a background check. What came back nearly made her spill her coffee. Zach had been charged 2 years ago with credit card fraud and identity theft. Got off with probation thanks to a slick private attorney, but his record was still visible to anyone who bothered to look. He had also been evicted from a rental in the neighboring county after accidentally constructing an unpermitted treehouse structure on property he didn't own. The owner, a 73-year-old woman who had filed a police report when Zach claimed it was his grandmother's summer parcel. In other words, this wasn't his first illegal squat. Jenna smiled grimly and said, "They've added a clown to the circus. That helps us." We kept digging. I hired a private investigator, Dave Landon, retired sheriff's deputy who now made his living unearthing small-town garbage for lawsuits just like mine. Within a week, he handed me a manila envelope of gold. Emails between Karen and HOA board members surfaced, courtesy of a whistleblower who Landon had convinced to cooperate in exchange for anonymity. One email from Karen read, "Zach deserves this. The old man's barely moved in. Once he gets wind of how serious we are, he'll crack. We'll let Zach handle the rest." Another read, "Start the narrative now. Post about community disruption, shoreline aesthetics. Call in those favor votes from the Randleys and Thatchers. If we control the tone, the facts won't matter. Then the real gem. I don't care what the county map says. That land is ours in spirit. In 30 days, he'll be gone, or we'll make sure the county sees him as the squatter." That was enough to make even Jenna curse. We added it to the amended complaint. Fraud. Coordinated intimidation, conspiracy to fabricate legal authority. Karen had crossed the line from nuisance to criminal. While the paperwork moved, the harassment didn't stop. I came home one night to find a sign planted on the outer edge of my driveway that read, "Pending HOA action, unsafe structure, do not occupy." It had the Lakewood HOA seal printed in the corner, but it wasn't laminated, and it was staked into my gravel like a threat disguised as a building code. I tore it down and checked my cameras. Caught Zach himself, ball cap low, cigarette dangling, hammer in hand. He looked at my lens, flipped it off, and walked back down the trail like he'd just conquered something. That night, I filed a separate police report. Tampering, harassment. Jenna requested a protective order and filed a motion to escalate the timeline of the civil suit based on ongoing hostile activity. 2 days later, a neighbor from across the lake, Marcia Wells, soft-spoken, always wore gardening gloves, even in winter, showed up at my gate. She handed me a thermos of coffee and an envelope. "I'm not getting involved in your business," she said, "but I thought you should see this." Inside were photocopies of internal HOA newsletters, ones never mailed to non-members, including minutes from board meetings. In one, Karen stated that HOA exploratory teams may need to enter contested parcels to assess environmental impact. Another noted that volunteer enforcement agents may be called upon to document potential code violations on reclaimed land. Reclaimed, like I was some ancient ruin they were graciously restoring. I thanked Marcia. She smiled faintly and said, "I don't like bullies, especially ones in pearls." The next morning, Jenna filed an emergency injunction to prevent any representatives of the HOA from entering my property, physically or electronically. At the same time, Landon uncovered a detail even I had forgotten. My uncle had actually registered the land as a conservation parcel for tax purposes in 1999. That meant any transfer of that property had to go through a county-level review, and no such request had ever been filed. The land was doubly locked in my name. We filed everything. The court set a date. Karen didn't know it yet, but she'd walked her HOA into a buzzsaw. And her darling boy. He was about to get a crash course in what happens when you screw with an old soldier who builds his own home with his own damn hands. I was gone for less than 4 hours. Just a quick supply run into town, screws, sandpaper, and a replacement fitting for the gutter that had split in the freeze. I barely made it to the hardware store before my phone pinged. Motion alert, then another, and another. I pulled over and opened the live camera feed. 3 people were on my porch. One of them wore a reflective vest. Another had a clipboard. The third was none other than Zach, lounging against the wall like he owned the place. A 4th man stood by the trailhead, clearly acting as lookout. None of them had uniforms. None of them had warrants. And they sure as hell didn't have permission. I hit record, reversed my truck, and called the sheriff. By the time I made it back up the gravel road, 2 cruisers were already there. The so-called inspection team had retreated down toward the lake, trying to look harmless. Karen was not with them, but her name was on their printed order. Community Oversight Visit, Lakewood Garden Hills, HOA. No signature, no legal backing, just a lot of bold fonts. Deputy Collins met me at the gate. "Mr. Lynch, we've detained them temporarily. You want to press charges for trespass?" "You're damn right I do." Zach tried to smirk when they cuffed him, until the deputy read him the part about breaking and entering with intent to intimidate. One of the clipboard men cracked, said they were told by President Brooks that the land was under contested HOA jurisdiction and that the old guy was unlikely to be home. I made sure that all of it got written into the report. The deputy nodded at my camera system. "Good thing you had eyes up." Later that evening, Jenna and I met at her office to go over everything. She'd already been notified of the incident. Karen had called the sheriff herself trying to file a counter-complaint. Claimed I was hostile and threatened community oversight officers. The sheriff's office had dismissed it outright after seeing the footage. What Jenna showed me next made my stomach twist. Landon had gotten a hold of Karen's internal HOA chat logs through a whistleblower. There, plain as daylight, was a message sent 2 days before. "We go in Thursday. He'll be gone. No one checks those properties during the week. Zach leads. Make it look like an environmental safety sweep. Worst case, we play dumb. If he retaliates, it helps our narrative." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Not just arrogance. This was premeditated. Jenna smiled grimly. "We just got our criminal intent. We amended the civil suit again, now including attempted unlawful entry, coordination of illegal activity, and targeting a private citizen through false representation of authority." Jenna filed for an emergency court order barring any member of the HOA from contacting me or stepping within 50 feet of my land. It was approved that night. The next morning, Karen went live on the HOA's Facebook page, crying about dangerous loners who endanger our peaceful community with their military paranoia. She ended with, "We're only trying to protect the value of our homes." I shared the video with the sheriff. His reply, "She just admitted motive on camera." The court hearing was set for 2 weeks out, but the fallout came fast. Karen's community meetings turned tense. Several HOA members who had blindly supported her began to backpedal once they saw the arrest reports and learned about the message logs. One anonymous neighbor even slipped an envelope under my gate. Printouts of a newsletter draft Karen had written, bragging that the lakeside plot would soon be available for strategic redevelopment. Her words, in ink. Jenna handed the whole file over to the county DA's office. The charge, attempted coercion of property through fraudulent community authority. A rarely used law, but exactly what fit the situation. In the meantime, my property became a kind of quiet battleground. Drones started buzzing overhead. Cheap ones, noisy, clearly amateur. Someone dumped trash at the bottom of my driveway. One morning, I found a crudely painted sign staked near the fence. This land was promised. Jenna said not to engage, but I couldn't just sit and wait. So I called in a friend from my old unit, Briggs, ex-scout sniper turned private security consultant. 2 days later, we installed perimeter alarms, infrared trail sensors, and an extra line of fencing with motion-triggered floodlights. Not because I was afraid, because I was documenting everything. That paid off the following Friday. Around 3 in the morning, a motion sensor went off near the old boathouse. I checked the feed and saw 2 silhouettes, one crouched, holding what looked like a can of spray paint. The other seemed to be fiddling with my dock locks. I hit record and called the sheriff again. They caught one of them running. The other slipped away across the frozen reeds. The one they got? None other than Zach. Again. This time with bolt cutters in his backpack, gloves, a flashlight, and a bottle of lighter fluid. They booked him for trespassing, attempted arson, and destruction of private property. Jenna didn't even blink. That's enough for a protective order. And maybe probation violation. When word got out that Zach had been caught trying to set fire to my boathouse, even Karen's staunchest defenders started to turn. The sheriff issued a statement confirming that private security footage had captured the event and that the land in question was not HOA jurisdiction. Local papers picked it up. Karen issued a clarifying statement that she had no knowledge of her son's actions and was deeply concerned. She called him troubled, but then she doubled down, filed a new complaint to the county clerk, arguing that my property had historically been part of the community's development plan and that my presence created visual discord and safety concerns. She requested a formal review of the land's boundaries. Jenna laughed out loud when she saw it. Let her keep digging. That's a federal offense waiting to happen. We prepared a response with documentation, satellite images from the last 20 years, my deed with GPS boundary data, a signed affidavit from the Land Commission office, and the tax logs dating back to when I inherited the place. But I wanted one more nail in the coffin. I asked Landon to run a full archive sweep on the HOA's filings over the last decade. What he found made me sit down. Back in 2010, Karen had submitted a proposed community expansion map that included my land, without notifying the county, and without ever contacting me. It had been quietly rejected by the zoning board. But the draft still sat in her internal HOA files, labeled Phase 3 Future Waterfront Homes. She'd been planning this for over a decade. I wasn't just some obstacle. I was the loose end she thought would never come back to haunt her. The court date finally arrived. Snow still clung to the ground, half melted and gray, but the courthouse was warm, buzzing with tension. Karen showed up in a tailored beige suit and pearls, acting like she was heading to a charity luncheon, not a civil and criminal proceeding. Zach wasn't with her. Rumor had it his lawyer had advised him to keep a low profile until his separate charges were addressed. Inside the courtroom, it was all cold light and quiet murmurs. The judge, stern, older, clearly not new to HOA drama, took his seat and called the case. I sat with Jenna, her binder thick enough to anchor a boat. Behind me, Briggs, Mark the surveyor, and 2 neighbors who had reached out after reading the story in the paper. They wanted to testify. Said they'd seen enough of Karen's leadership to know I wasn't the first person she tried to steamroll. The first hour went by with Jenna presenting the chain of ownership, deeds, maps, tax records, GIS overlays. No fluff, just proof. She showed the footage from the trespassing incident, the texts from HOA board members, and the intercepted message about going in Thursday. The judge's brow creased slightly when that came up. Karen's attorney, a younger man who looked like he regretted taking the case, tried to introduce the so-called verbal promise from Karen's father. The judge didn't even let him finish. If it's not in writing, it's not before this court. Then came the forged agreement, the one where Karen had faked my uncle's signature to claim the land had been intended for young community members. Jenna ripped it apart. She called up a handwriting analyst who showed discrepancies in stroke weight and pressure. She presented timestamp metadata showing the document had been created on a laptop purchased in 2021, 14 years after my uncle had passed away. By the time we broke for lunch, Karen looked less composed. The pearls stayed on, but the smile had vanished. When court resumed, we called our last witness, the county zoning officer who'd received Karen's expansion map proposal in 2010. He confirmed it had been rejected, never filed officially, and that it included land clearly outside the HOA's legal boundaries. My land, the same land I had cleared, built on, and defended for over a decade. Karen's turn came. She stood to speak. Her voice was calm, but you could hear the tremor under it. She claimed concern, said her actions were motivated by a desire to preserve community harmony, that she only wanted to ensure proper oversight of environmental impact. When asked about the messages, she claimed they were taken out of context. When asked about the Forged document. She denied involvement, blamed it on a clerical misunderstanding. When asked if she authorized the inspection team, she answered, "I don't recall." Jenna leaned in and whispered, "Classic perjury dodge. Let's see if the judge buys it." He didn't. After a short recess, the judge delivered his verdict. Full property rights affirmed to me. The HOA's claims were declared fraudulent. The forged document was referred to the district attorney for criminal charges. The protective order remained in place. And Karen. She was found personally liable for the trespass, defamation, and attempted coercion. The court ordered her to pay $185,000 in damages and legal fees. But the real blow came next. The judge instructed the county to initiate an audit of the HOA's finances and governance structure. Their charter was officially under review. As the gavel fell, Karen didn't move. Her attorney started gathering papers in silence. The pearls didn't shine as much under the fluorescent lights anymore. Outside, Jenna shook my hand, then clapped me on the back. "You just made case law." The morning after the verdict, I sat on the porch of my cabin with a mug of strong black coffee and a silence I hadn't tasted in months. No shouting, no threats. No envelopes with HOA letterhead slid under my door in the dead of night. Just the wind through the pines and the gentle lapping of Briar Creek against the rocks below. It was over, or at least as over as these things ever get. The court had ruled, the fines had been levied, and Karen, queen of the Lakeside Illusion, was due to spend 6 months behind county bars for forgery, fraud, and unlawful harassment. Her mugshot even made the local paper, printed beside a headline that read, "HOA President Faces Jail for Property Scheme." Apparently, the community had turned on her quickly. The HOA board fractured within days of the ruling. Several members resigned. Others called for a complete dissolution. The county audit was underway, and rumor had it, the books were full of creative math. Membership fees spent on travel ice consulting, even luxury wine deliveries billed as community outreach. The new treasurer filed a public statement apologizing to anyone Karen had wrongfully targeted. I didn't get a letter from Karen herself, but I didn't need one. What I did get was better. 3 days after the verdict, a group of neighbors, people I'd never really spoken to, showed up with tools, lumber, and a few cases of beer. One was a retired carpenter, another was a landscaper. "Heard you might want to put in a dock," one of them said. "We figured you've earned the help." I laughed for the first time in weeks. Real deep belly laughter. The kind you don't fake. The kind that only comes when something ugly finally lets go of your chest. So, we built. Over the next month, the place transformed. A new cedar deck went up. Solar panels were installed on the southern face. A gravel path curved down to a fresh-built dock anchored with stone and timber. The land felt clean again. Mine again. And on the hand-hewn post by the front gate, I hung a sign I'd carved myself, burnt letters etched deep into solid oak. 10 years by hand. No son of Karen shall pass. People took photos of it. Someone posted it online. It went viral for a few days. I even got a letter from a county over saying, "We used your case to stop our HOA from trying to seize a family orchard." I didn't reply. Didn't need to. It was enough to know it meant something beyond my fences. Zach disappeared from town last I heard, moved out west. His car was repossessed before he left, and someone said they saw him working part-time at a ski rental shop. I don't wish him ill, but I hope he learns the value of building something himself. As for me, I keep building, not for defense anymore, just for peace. There's a rhythm to hammer and nail, sawdust and pine. There's clarity in ownership, not just on paper, but in soul. I don't check the cameras much these days, not because I'm careless, but because no one comes up that road anymore unless they're invited, and that's the way it should be.